panic attacks, emotional flashbacks, severe anxiety attacks, short circuiting, emotional flooding, a loss of being grounded in reality, living instead through an overlay of fear, a sense of threat, and a sense of disability. That's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to kind of switch back and forth between Eckhart Tolle's pain body theory, and I'm going to read straight out of his book, A New Earth, from the pain body chapter. And I'm going to talk about how that is basically the exact same thing as what Pete Walker calls an emotional flashback in his awesome book, Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving. Pete Walker, again, is his name. So I found this book about 5 years ago, and it really turned a key for me, a major key. This was one of the few books that over the years after I read it, I bought several copies and sent it to relatives, friends, people that I thought could really benefit from it. I don't think anyone actually read it, but it was one of those that just, it turned a key, and it really opened my mind to understanding things. It was hugely helpful for me to understand what I was dealing with when I would have an emotional flashback, which was being labeled as a panic attack and ultimately panic disorder by allopathic medicine and, by my psychiatrist, my therapist. That was the best thing that they had to identify what I was dealing with. So Pete Walker is also in the medical community. He's a psychotherapist, and he knows about CPTSD so much because he's a survivor. He's someone who suffered from severe emotional flashbacks, and he had to kind of dig through his own childhood and work with his own understanding of psychology to develop his theories about emotional flashbacks and how to remedy the situation, because it's a condition where, like with a panic attack, you can get triggered really easily, even if you know all the external triggers, even if you avoid the places that usually overstimulate you or send you into feeling activated, adrenalized. It can still sneak up on you. It can come from an internal place. It can come from unconscious thoughts running in the background. And when there's an emotional component to it, it can be completely debilitating. It can be so overwhelming that it alters your personality. It alters your ability to function in the world and relationships. It's a terrible burden to feel stuck with, to feel like it is a mass of character flaws and unworthiness and any negative message that you got from either childhood abuse or neglect, any past trauma that puts you kind of locked into the emotional trauma that just renders you feeling powerless, vulnerable, and unsafe, constantly under the threat of danger or the threat of abandonment. So first, I want to talk about Pete Walker's teaching on complex PTSD, but specifically the emotional flashback, so that I can illuminate anybody that doesn't know what an emotional flashback is. I'm going to go into how he describes it and what it looks like, how you deal with it a little bit. I highly recommend, if this interests you, if you think that you are dealing with this, get the book. Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. So the book will go into he provides endless tips and remedies and techniques, and it's worth reading the book and looking into it, even though ultimately in this video I'm going to talk about what I think he leaves out and where Eckhart Tolle takes it more to the root of the problem and to the ultimate remedy, which is presence, because it is about presence of mind. Panic attacks, emotional flashbacks, everything in that category is about dissociating. It's about losing your higher consciousness to the runaway mind, to compulsive thinking, to the inner critic, Let me get to Pete Walker's words before I just kind of fumble it with my own uneducated guessing on this stuff. So, Pete Walker, emotional flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks are intensely disturbing regressions, amygdala-hijackings. These reactions occur in the brains of people who have been triggered into a 4F reaction so often that minor events now trigger them into a panicky state. 4F reactions, he's referring to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. A common sensation when you are going into flashback or you're in flashback is the feeling of being small, fragile, and helpless. It is a regression to a childhood state. You could also have a sense of having a dead battery. You could be so sensitive or on edge that just being seen by another person suddenly makes you feel excruciatingly vulnerable. And this fear can launch you into heady worrying, he says, or numbing and spacing out. So that's where the more obvious dissociation comes in. Rushing can also activate the brain's flight response. So triggers are what instigate these activities and responses in the body, the mind, and the emotions. A trigger can be an external or internal stimulus that activates us into an emotional flashback. And this often occurs outside the boundaries of normal consciousness. External triggers are people, places, things, events, facial expressions, styles of communication, etc. Anything that reminds us of our original trauma and flashes us back to painful feelings of the past. Common triggers could be revisiting parents, seeing someone who resembles a childhood abuser, the anniversary of an especially traumatic event, or just hearing someone use a parent's shaming tone of voice or turn of phrase. Sometimes any and all unknown adults can trigger us into fear even without them bearing resemblance. Sometimes someone looking at us or even noticing us can trigger us into fear and toxic shame. Being stared at or glared at, making a mistake, asking for help, having to speak in front of a group of people, all of this activates the inner critic or the inner parent the parent's voice that we internalize. Also, simply feeling tired, sick, lonely, or hungry can trigger a flashback. Physical pain of any type can be a trigger, as well as authority figures. One common trigger is called the look, a facial expression that typically accompanies contempt. Contempt is a powerful, punishing visage backed up by an emotional force field of intimidation and disgust. Now imagine that force field coming from a parent to a child. The child getting the look receives the message that they are in serious jeopardy, excuse me, but also receives the message that they are a sorry excuse for a human being. Now, most young children, Pete Walker observed, they will ignore the look unless the look was previously accompanied by traumatizing punishment. The look is empowered by the psychological process of conditioning. With enough pairings of the look with physical punishment or extreme abandonment, the look itself is all that's needed to evoke fear in the child. The look then becomes a powerful trigger for making adult survivors flash back to the fear and humiliation of their childhoods. Now, many clients don't remember this because the punishment or abandonment only had to accompany the look for a few months while they were toddlers before it became permanently wired as a trigger. We internalize our parents. They become the voice of our inner critic that beats us up, rejects us, and continues to give us the look whenever we are less than perfect. For a lot of kids growing up, perfection is a way of staying out of trouble, staying off the radar of the abuse. And when some people are flashing back, they actually will unconsciously scowl contemptuously at themselves while they're in flashback. They're reliving the sense of the parent being disgusted with them, and then they've now internalized it as self-disgust and self-contempt. When anyone else looks at us disapprovingly, we can generalize that they are as dangerous as our parents. We erroneously transfer and project our memory of the look onto other people when we're triggered. So it turns out that internal triggers are actually more common. The inner critic and its programs is the likely culprit for an internal trigger. Typically, this is going to be in the form of thoughts and visualizations about endangerment or the need for perfection. For example, a survivor may, seemingly without reason, visualize someone being abusive. They could also worry themselves into a flashback by just thinking obsessively about not executing a task perfectly. Or they could be stuck dwelling on all the ways they might mess up something in the future. And when other people are around, miscues can turn into full-blown emotional flashbacks. So that was a lot of triggers to consider. And I'm sure if you think about it, there's a lot more you can think of that are more personal to you. Identifying triggers helps us get into flashback management mode more quickly. Recognition further aids us to handle unavoidable triggering situations because, we do start out by avoiding triggers, but a lot of these things just can't be avoided. They come up naturally, randomly. It's not something that we can plan for or avoid. So it's key to have the control not being on the outside environment, but on the internal environment of the mind, the consciousness, the focus, the thoughts, all of that. So recognition that we've been triggered is kind of how you catch this from pulling you into identifying with it and having it turn into a full-blown panic attack or emotional flashback. Recognizing the moment of triggering is even more important than recognizing the trigger itself. Flashbacks can start out subtly and then progressively become more intense. And resolving a flashback requires rebalancing significant biochemical changes in the brain and body that take time to subside. Over-adrenalization sometimes dramatically morphs into the hangover of adrenaline exhaustion. I know I would feel that before, and that would add a whole new layer of anxiety of the recovery I would need after a panic attack would take place. So decreasing the intensity of a flashback decreases the time it takes for our physiology to recover. So catching the trigger early is, you're not just sparing yourself emotional pain and emotional flashback, you're sparing your body the hyper-adrenalization process and then having to come down from that. So Pete Walker does provide 13 steps for flashback management. I'm not going to go over them in this video, but I will mention that the first step is to name the experience and just say to yourself, I'm having a flashback. And this is so powerful to name it because this is going to bring you out of what Eckhart Tolle repeatedly calls compulsive thinking. When you name it and say, I am having a flashback, you're bringing your awareness into the present moment as an observer consciousness that now recognizes that it is not this vulnerable victim that's been reactivated as a memory. So naming it brings you into the present moment. It brings you into your consciousness of presence that isn't lost in the story. It's kind of now higher as an observer consciousness, looking at it without identifying with it, without getting sucked into it. So let's look at some early signs of a flashback to help you recognize that trigger earlier. An early sign of being in a flashback that is sneaking up gradually, the sense of feeling small, helpless, and hopeless. Feeling fragile, on edge, easily crushable. Also, an evaporation of our esteem that has been earned since we left home. So everything that you have to feel good about yourself since you've become an adult just seems to disappear from your awareness and memory. We are flashed back to childhood years where implicit family rules forbade any self-esteem at all. So a lot of times as an adult, we will have a impulse to act with self-assertion, and that can be fully appropriate. But with that impulse comes an enormous rush of fear, because that was not allowed. The esteem to assert yourself as a child was not allowed for many people. So it brings fear with it as an adult. Another early sign is an increase in the severity or hostility of the inner critic. Notice when it is drasticizing and catastrophizing. You may also notice intensified self-criticism or judgmentalness of others. The inner critic can quickly become the outer critic. That scolding tone can be directed at you one minute and then the next be directed at whoever is around you. Also, another early sign is lapsing into polarized all or none thinking, such as only being able to see what's wrong with yourself or others. Another clue that we're in flashback is when we notice that our emotional reactions are out of proportion to what has triggered them. A minor upset can feel like an emergency, or a minor unfairness can feel like a travesty of justice. With a flashback, there is a mechanism of dissociation. It's like an amnesia of all the trust and reliability we may have already established with people, as well as the trust that we've already established with ourselves. We kind of lose the ground that we've acquired if we've, say, been on the self-help path and trying to, work with healing from panic disorder. When we're triggered and, really it gets intense, you forget how far you've come. You forget the progress you've made. You forget all the strength that you have inside you. And lastly, another sign that you could be in flashback is having a feeling of distrust with proven friendships. You can be flashing back to a time when no one around you was trustworthy. Recovering requires being able to recognize inner critic catastrophizing so that we can resist it with thought stopping and thought correction. Thought correction would be like reminding yourself of the positives which have slipped your mind, or recognizing that a situation is fairly neutral and not actually an emergency or travesty. When your recovery matures sufficiently, Pete Walker says, you realize that much of the emotional pain of your flashbacks is appropriate but delayed reactions to your childhood abuse and neglect. Once you become proficient at identifying intense critic attacks, you typically develop the mindfulness necessary to notice more subtle attacks. All right, so that was Pete's Walker way of what I would describe as that in cases of childhood abuse and neglect, a conditioning of the mind takes place, creating a toxic inner critic voice that runs in the adult mind in the form of hostile compulsive thinking, barely conscious compulsive thinking, that reanimates intense emotional energy and floods our body with adrenaline, simultaneously regressing us to a past moment of extreme vulnerability and danger. So we're looking at what Eckhart Tolle has called an epidemic of mind identification. People operating on compulsive, unchecked thinking. And this was something that, our parents raised us with these mentalities, and we now live with these mentalities, and now we raise our kids with these mentalities. It's very unchecked. So not only have we normalized the overlooking of the damage that we're incurring as unconscious or ignorant parents, we're not just spiritually and emotionally abandoning our children, we're conditioning our children to have this toxic perceiver overlay how they experience reality, and to be vulnerable to being triggered into dissociating from reality and falling back into this fearful state. Presence, as taught by Eckhart Tolle, is, in my opinion, the ultimate remedy to panic attacks, emotional flashbacks, the toxic inner critic, the mind-identified being, all the suffering of getting tricked or hijacked into dissociating from present-day reality. And like I said, From Surviving to Thriving, Pete Walker's book helped tremendously because I was able to put a confusing, painful experience into context that was humane and fair and validating. But not enough attention, I felt, was given to the ability to become above the thoughts. There wasn't much talk about connecting to inner stillness, to bringing the consciousness into the present moment, to bringing awareness into the body, say, as a technique for grounding in reality. And there wasn't really any hope for permanently getting out of this conditioning. So, years later is when I started reading Eckhart Tolle's books, and only earlier this year did I get around to reading A New Earth. And in A New Earth, he talks about something very similar to emotional flashbacks, the pain body. Here is where a spiritual component to how you conceptualize this is going to help greatly in understanding how so much emotional energy can flood through us, coming from seemingly no apparent source or cause. The pain body carries emotional memory not just from our childhood, but from ancestors, past lives, the lives of other creatures, and the earth itself. So this is Eckhart Tolle, A New Earth. This is actually a copy I'm borrowing from a friend, and I would like to read you direct from his chapter on the pain body. He puts it into the best words, and I think it will be the most useful to whoever is interested in this. The greater part of most people's thinking is involuntary, automatic, and repetitive. It is no more than a kind of mental static and fulfills no real purpose. Strictly speaking, you don't think. Thinking happens to you. The statement, I think, implies volition. It implies that you have a say in the matter, that there is choice involved on your part. For most people, this is not the case. I think is just as false a statement as I digest or I circulate my blood. Digestion happens, circulation happens, thinking happens. The voice in the head has a life of its own. Most people are at the mercy of that voice. They are possessed by thought, by the mind, and since the mind is conditioned by the past, you are then forced to reenact the past again and again. The Eastern term for this is karma. When you are identified with that voice, you don't know this, of course. If you knew it, you would no longer be possessed because you are only truly possessed when you mistake the possessing entity for who you are. That is to say, when you become it. For thousands of years, humanity has been increasingly mind-possessed, failing to recognize the possessing entity as not self. Through complete identification with the mind, a false sense of self, the ego, came into existence. The density of the ego depends on the degree to which you, the consciousness, are identified with your mind, with thinking. Thinking is no more than a tiny aspect of the totality of consciousness, the totality of who you are. The degree of identification with the mind differs from person to person. Some people enjoy periods of freedom from it, however brief, and the peace, joy, and aliveness they experience in those moments make life worth living. These are also the moments when creativity, love, and compassion arise. Others are constantly trapped in the egoic state. They are alienated from themselves as well as from others and the world around them. When you look at them, you may see the tension in their face, perhaps the furrowed brow or the absent or staring expression in their eyes. Most of their attention is absorbed by thinking, and so they don't really see you, and they are not really listening to you. They are not present in any situation, their attention being either in the past or the future, which, of course, exist only in the mind as thought forms. Or they relate to you through some kind of role they play and so are not themselves. Most people are alienated from who they are, and some are alienated to such a degree that the way they behave and interact is recognized as phony by almost everyone, except those who are equally phony, equally alienated from who they are. Alienation means you don't feel at ease in any situation, any place, or with any person, not even with yourself. You are always trying to get home, but never feel at home. Some of the greatest writers of the 20th century recognized alienation as the universal dilemma of human existence, probably felt it deeply within themselves, and so were able to express it brilliantly in their works. They don't offer a solution. Their contribution is to show us a reflection of the human predicament so that we can see it more clearly. To see one's predicament clearly is a first step toward going beyond it. Just like with Pete Walker's first step in emotional flashback management, recognize it, name it. The birth of emotion. In addition to the movement of thought, although not entirely separate from it, there is another dimension to the ego, emotion. This is not to say that all thinking and all emotion are of the ego. They turn into ego only when you identify with them and they take you over completely. That is to say, when they become I. The physical organism, your body, has its own intelligence, as does the organism of every other life form. And that intelligence reacts to what your mind is saying, reacts to your thoughts. So emotion is the body's reaction to your mind. The body's intelligence is, of course, an inseparable part of universal intelligence, one of its countless manifestations. It gives temporary cohesion to the atoms and molecules that make up your physical organism. It is the organizing principle behind the workings of all the organs of the body, the conversion of oxygen and food into energy, the heartbeat and circulation of the blood, the immune system that protects the body from invaders, the translation of sensory input into nerve impulses that are sent to the brain, decoded there, and reassembled into a coherent inner picture of outer reality. All these, as well as thousands of other simultaneously occurring functions, are coordinated perfectly by that intelligence. You don't run your body. The intelligence does. It also is in charge of the organism's responses to its environment. This is true for any life form. It is the same intelligence that brought the planet into physical form and then manifests as the flower that comes out of the plant, the flower that opens its petals in the morning to receive the rays of the sun and closes them at nighttime. It is the same intelligence that manifests as Gaia, the complex living being that is planet Earth. This intelligence gives rise to instinctive reactions of the organism to any threat or challenge. It produces responses in animals that appear to be akin to human emotions, anger, fear, pleasure. These instinctive responses could be considered primordial forms of emotion. In certain situations, human beings experience instinctive responses in the same way that animals do. In the face of danger, when the survival of the organism is threatened, the heart beats faster, the muscles contract, breathing becomes rapid in preparation for fight or flight. Primordial fear. When being cornered, a sudden flare-up of intense energy gives strength to the body that it didn't have before. Primordial anger. These instinctive responses appear akin to emotions, but are not emotions in the true sense of the word. The fundamental difference between an instinctive response and an emotion is this. An instinctive response is the body's direct response to some external situation. An emotion, on the other hand, is the body's response to a thought. Indirectly, an emotion can also be a response to an actual situation or event, but it will be a response to the event seen through the filter of a mental interpretation, the filter of thought, that is to say, through the mental concepts of good and bad, like and dislike, me and mine. For example, it is likely you won't feel any emotion when you are told that someone's car has been stolen, but when it is your car, you will probably feel upset. It is amazing how much emotion a little mental concept like my can generate, mine. Although the body is very intelligent, it cannot tell the difference between an actual situation and a thought. It reacts to every thought as if it were a reality. It doesn't know it is just a thought. To the body, a worrisome, fearful thought means I am in danger, and it responds accordingly, even though you may be lying in a warm and comfortable bed at night. The heart beats faster, muscles contract, breathing becomes rapid. There is a buildup of energy, But since the danger is only a mental fiction, the energy has no outlet. Part of it is fed back to the mind and generates even more anxious thought. The rest of the energy turns toxic and interferes with the harmonious functioning of the body. Emotions and the ego. The ego is not only the unobserved mind, the voice in the head which pretends to be you, but also the unobserved emotions that are the body's reaction to what the voice in the head is saying. We have already seen what kind of thinking the egoic voice engages in most of the time and the dysfunction inherent in the structure of its thought processes, regardless of content. This dysfunctional thinking is what the body reacts to with negative emotion. The voice in the head tells a story that the body believes in and reacts to. Those reactions are the emotions. The emotions, in turn, feed energy back to the thoughts that created the emotion in the first place. This is the vicious circle between unexamined thoughts and emotions, giving rise to emotional thinking and emotional story making. The emotional component of ego differs from person to person. In some egos, it is greater than others. Thoughts that trigger emotional responses in the body may sometimes come so fast that before the mind has had time to voice them, the body has already responded with an emotion, and the emotion has turned into a reaction. Those thoughts exist at a pre-verbal stage and could be called unspoken unconscious assumptions. They have their origin in a person's past conditioning, usually from early childhood. People cannot be trusted would be an example of such an unconscious assumption in a person whose primordial relationships, that is to say, with parents or siblings, were not supportive and did not inspire trust. Here are a few more common unconscious assumptions. Nobody respects and appreciates me. I need to fight to survive. There is never enough money. Life always lets you down. I don't deserve abundance. I don't deserve love. Unconscious assumptions create emotions in the body, which in turn generate mind activity and/or instant reactions. In this way, they create your personal reality. The voice of the ego continuously disrupts the body's natural state of well-being. Almost every human body is under a great deal of strain and stress, not because it is threatened by some external factor, but from within the mind. The body has an ego attached to it, and it cannot but respond to all the dysfunctional thought patterns that make up the ego. Thus, a stream of negative emotion accompanies the stream of incessant and compulsive thinking. What is a negative emotion? An emotion that is toxic to the body and interferes with its balance and harmonious functioning. Fear, anxiety, anger, bearing a grudge, sadness, hatred or intense dislike, jealousy, envy, all disrupt the energy flow through the body, affect the heart, the immune system, digestion, production of hormones, and so on. Even mainstream medicine, although it knows very little about how the ego operates yet, is beginning to recognize the connection between negative emotional states and physical disease. An emotion that does harm to the body also infects the people you come into contact with, and indirectly, through a process of chain reaction, countless others you never meet. There is a generic term for all negative emotions: unhappiness. Do positive emotions then have the opposite effect on the physical body? Do they strengthen the immune system, invigorate and heal the body? They do indeed, but we need to differentiate between positive emotions that are ego-generated and deeper emotions that emanate from your natural state of connectedness with being. Positive emotions generated by the ego already contain within themselves their opposite, into which they can quickly turn. Here are some examples. What the ego calls love is possessiveness and addictive clinging that can turn into hate within a second. Anticipation about an upcoming event, which is the ego's overvaluation of future, easily turns into its opposite, letdown or disappointment, when the event is over or doesn't fulfill the ego's expectations. Praise and recognition make you feel alive and happy one day. Being criticized or ignored make you dejected and unhappy the next. The pleasure of a wild party turns into bleakness and a hangover the next morning. There is not good without bad, no high without low. Ego-generated emotions are derived from the mind's identification with external factors which are, of course, all unstable and liable to change at any moment. The deeper emotions are not really emotions at all, but states of being. Emotions exist within the realm of opposites. States of being can be obscured, but they have no opposite. They emanate from within you as the love, joy, and peace that are aspects of your true nature. The duck with a human mind. In The Power of Now, I mentioned my observation that after two ducks get into a fight, which never lasts long, they will separate and float off in opposite directions. Then each duck will flap its wings vigorously a few times, thus releasing the surplus energy that built up during the fight. After they flap their wings, they float on peacefully as if nothing had ever happened. If the duck had had a human mind, it would keep the fight alive by thinking, by story making. This would probably be the duck's story. I don't believe what he just did. He came to within 5 inches of me. He thinks he owns this pond. He has no consideration for my private space. I'll never trust him again. Next time he'll try something else just to annoy me. I'm sure he's plotting something already. I'm not going to stand for this. I'll teach him a lesson he won't forget. And on the mind spins its tales, still thinking and talking about it days, months, or years later. As far as the body is concerned, the fight is still continuing, and the energy it generates in response to all those thoughts is emotion, which in turn generates more thinking. This becomes the emotional thinking of the ego. You can see how problematic the duck's life would become if it had a human mind, but this is how most humans live all the time. No situation or event is ever really finished. The mind and the mind-made me and my story keep it going. We are a species that has lost its way. Everything natural, every tree or flower, every animal have an important lesson to teach us if we would only stop, look, and listen. Our duck's lesson is this: flap your wings, which translates as let go of the story and return to the only place of power, the present moment. Individual and collective pain bodies. Any negative emotion that is not fully faced and seen for what it is in the moment it arises does not completely dissolve. It leaves behind a remnant of pain. Children in particular find strong negative emotions too overwhelming to cope with and tend to try not to feel them. In the absence of a fully conscious adult who guides them with love and compassion into facing the emotion directly, choosing not to feel it is indeed the only option for the child at that time. Unfortunately, that early defense mechanism usually remains in place when the child becomes an adult. The emotion still lives in him or her unrecognized and manifests indirectly, for example, as anxiety, anger, outbursts of violence, a mood, or even as a physical illness. In some cases, it interferes with or sabotages every intimate relationship. Most psychotherapists have met patients who claim initially to have had a totally happy childhood, and later the opposite turned out to be the case. Those may be the more extreme cases, but nobody can go through childhood without suffering emotional pain. Even if both your parents were enlightened, you would still find yourself growing up in a largely unconscious world. The remnants of pain left behind by every strong negative emotion that is not fully faced, accepted, and then let go of, join together to form an energy field that lives in the very cells of your body. It consists not just of childhood pain, but also painful emotions that were added to it later in adolescence and during your adult life, much of it created by the voice of the ego. It is the emotional pain that is your unavoidable companion when a false sense of self is the basis of your life. This energy field of the old but still very much alive emotion that lives in almost every human being is the pain body. The pain body, however, is not just individual in nature. It also partakes of the pain suffered by countless humans throughout the history of humanity, which is a story of continuous tribal warfare, of enslavement, pillage, rape, torture, and other forms of violence. This pain still lives in the collective psyche of humanity and is being added to on a daily basis, as you can verify when you watch the news tonight or look at the drama in people's relationships. The collective pain body is probably encoded within every human's DNA, although we haven't discovered it there yet. Every newborn who comes into this world already carries an emotional pain body. In some, it is heavier, more dense than others. Some babies are quite happy most of the time. Others seem to carry an enormous amount of unhappiness within them. It is true that some babies cry a great deal because they are not given enough love and attention, but others cry for no apparent reason, almost as if they were trying to make everyone around them as unhappy as they are, and often they succeed. They have come into this world with a heavy share of human pain. Other babies may cry frequently because they can sense the emanation of their mother's and father's negative emotion, and it causes them pain and also causes their pain body to grow already by absorbing energy from the parents' pain bodies. Whatever the case may be, as the baby's physical body grows, so does the pain body. An infant with only a light pain body is not necessarily going to be a spiritually more advanced man or woman than somebody with a dense one. In fact, the opposite is often the case. People with heavy pain bodies usually have a better chance to awaken spiritually than those with a relatively light one. Whereas some of them do remain trapped in their heavy pain bodies, many others reach a point where they cannot live with their unhappiness any longer, and so their motivation to awaken becomes strong. Why is the suffering body of Christ, his face distorted in agony and his body bleeding from countless wounds, such a significant image in the collective consciousness of humanity? Millions of people, particularly in medieval times, would not have related to it as deeply as they did if something within themselves had not resonated with it, if they had not unconsciously recognized it as an outer representation of their own inner reality, the pain body. They were not yet conscious enough to recognize it directly within themselves, but it was the beginning of their becoming aware of it. Christ can be seen as the archetypal human, embodying both the pain and the possibility of transcendence. How the pain body renews itself. The pain body is a semi-autonomous energy form that lives within most human beings, an entity made up of emotion. It has its own primitive intelligence, not unlike a cunning animal, and its intelligence is directed primarily at survival. Like all life forms, it periodically needs to feed, to take in new energy, and the food it requires to replenish itself consists of energy that is compatible with its own. That's so crucial. Which is to say, energy that vibrates at a similar frequency. Any emotionally painful experience can be used as food by the pain body. That's why it thrives on negative thinking as well as drama in relationships. The pain body is an addiction to unhappiness. It may be shocking when you realize for the first time that there is something within you that periodically seeks emotional negativity. It seeks unhappiness. You need even more awareness to see it in yourself than to recognize it in another person. Once the unhappiness has taken you over, not only do you not want an end to it, but you want to make others just as miserable as you are in order to feed on their negative emotional reactions. In most people, the pain body has a dormant and an active stage. When it is dormant, you easily forget that you carry a heavy dark cloud or a dormant volcano inside you, depending on the energy field of your particular pain body. How long it remains dormant varies from person to person. A few weeks is the most common, but it can be a few days or months. In rare cases, the pain body can lie in hibernation for years before it gets triggered by some event. How the pain body feeds on your thoughts. The pain body awakens from its dormancy when it gets hungry, when it is time to replenish itself. Alternatively, it may get triggered by an event at any time. The pain body that is ready to feed can use the most insignificant event as a trigger, something somebody says or does, or even a thought. If you live alone and there is nobody around at the time, the pain body will feed on your thoughts. Suddenly, your thinking becomes deeply negative. You are most likely unaware that just prior to the influx of negative thinking, a wave of emotion invaded your mind, as a dark and heavy mood, an anxiety or fiery anger. All thought is energy, and the pain body is now feeding on the energy of your thoughts. But it cannot feed on any thought. You don't need to be particularly sensitive to notice that a positive thought has a totally different feeling tone than a negative one. It is the same energy, but it vibrates at a different frequency. A happy, positive thought is indigestible to the pain body. It can only feed on negative thoughts because only those thoughts are compatible with its own energy field. All things are vibrating energy fields in ceaseless motion. The chair you sit on, the book you are holding in your hand appears solid and motionless only because that is how your senses perceive their vibrational frequency. That is to say, the incessant movement of the molecules, atoms, electrons, and subatomic particles that together create what you perceive as a chair, a book, a tree, or a body. What we perceive as physical matter is energy vibrating at a particular range of frequencies. Thoughts consist of the same energy vibrating at a higher frequency than matter, which is why they cannot be seen or touched. Thoughts have their own range of frequencies, with negative thoughts at the lower end of the scale and positive thoughts at the higher. The vibrational frequency of the pain body resonates with that of negative thoughts, which is why only those thoughts can feed the pain body. The usual pattern of thought creating emotion is reversed in the case of the pain body, at least initially. Emotion from the pain body quickly gains control of your thinking, and once your mind has been taken over by the pain body, your thinking becomes negative. The voice in your head will be telling sad, anxious, or angry stories about yourself or your life, about other people, about the past, future, or imaginary events. The voice will be blaming, accusing, complaining, imagining. And you are totally identified with whatever the voice says, believe all its distorted thoughts. At that point, the addiction to unhappiness has set in. It is not so much that you cannot stop your train of negative thoughts, but that you don't want to. This is because the pain body at that time is living through you, pretending to be you. And to the pain body, pain is pleasure. It eagerly devours every negative thought. In fact, the usual voice in your head has now become the voice of the pain body. It has taken over the internal dialogue. A vicious circle becomes established between the pain body and your thinking. Every thought feeds the pain body, and in turn, the pain body generates more thoughts. At some point, after a few hours or even a few days, it has replenished itself and returns to its dormant stage, leaving behind a depleted organism and a body that is much more susceptible to illness. If that sounds to you like a psychic parasite, you are right. That is exactly what it is. How the pain body feeds on drama. If there are other people around, preferably your partner or a close family member, the pain body will attempt to provoke them, push their buttons, as the expression goes, so it can feed on the ensuing drama. Pain bodies love intimate relationships and families because that is where they get most of their food. It is hard to resist another person's pain body that is determined to draw you into a reaction. Instinctively, it knows your weakest, most vulnerable points. If it doesn't succeed the first time, it will try again and again. It is raw emotion looking for more emotion. The other person's pain body wants to awaken yours so that both pain bodies can mutually energize each other. Many relationships go through violent and destructive pain body episodes at regular intervals. It is almost unbearably painful for a young child to have to witness the emotional violence of their parents' pain bodies, and yet that is the fate of millions of children all over the world, the nightmare of their daily existence. That is also one of the main ways in which the human pain body is passed on from generation to generation. After each episode, the partners make up and there is an interval of relative peace to the limited extent that the ego allows it. Excessive consumption of alcohol will often activate the pain body, particularly in men, but also in some women. When a person becomes drunk, he goes through a complete personality change as the pain body takes him over. A deeply unconscious person whose pain body habitually replenishes itself through physical violence often directs it toward his spouse or children. When he becomes sober, he is truly sorry and may say that he will never do this again, and he means it. The person who is talking and making promises, however, is not the entity that commits the violence, and so you can be sure that it will happen again and again unless he becomes present, recognizes the pain body within himself, and thus disidentifies from it. In some cases, counseling can help him do that. Most pain bodies want to both inflict and suffer pain, but some are predominantly either perpetrators or victims. In either case, they feed on violence, whether emotional or physical. Some couples who may think they have fallen in love are actually feeling drawn to each other because their respective pain bodies complement each other. Sometimes the roles of perpetrator and victim are already clearly prescribed the first time they meet. Some marriages that are thought to be made in heaven are actually made in hell. It's getting a bit long. How much more do I have to go? Quite a bit. Well, let me pare it down just a bit. The collective female pain body. The collective dimension of the pain body has different strands in it. Tribes, nations, races all have their own collective pain body, some heavier than others, and most members of that tribe, nation, or race have a share in it to a greater or lesser degree. Almost every woman has her share in the collective female pain body, which tends to become activated particularly just prior to the time of menstruation. At that time, many women become overwhelmed by intense negative emotion. The suppression of the feminine principle, especially over the past 2,000 years, has enabled the ego to gain absolute supremacy in the collective human psyche. Although women have egos, of course, the ego can take root and grow more easily in the male form than in the female. This is because women are less mind-identified than men. They are more in touch with the inner body and the intelligence of the organism, where the intuitive faculties originate. The female form is less rigidly encapsulated than the male, has greater openness and sensitivity toward other life forms, and is more attuned to the natural world. If the balance between male and female energies had not been destroyed on our planet, the ego's growth would have been greatly curtailed. We would not have declared war on nature, and we would not be so completely alienated from our being. Nobody knows the exact figure because records were not kept, but it seems certain that during a 300-year period, between 3 and 5 million women were tortured and killed by the Holy Inquisition, an institution founded by the Roman Catholic Church to suppress heresy. This surely ranks together with the Holocaust as one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was enough for a woman to show a love for animals, walk alone in the fields or woods, or gather medicinal plants to be branded a witch, then tortured and burned at the stake. The sacred feminine was declared demonic, and an entire dimension largely disappeared from human experience. Other cultures and religions, such as Judaism, Islam, and even Buddhism, also suppressed the feminine dimension, although in a less violent way. Who was responsible for this fear of the feminine that could only be described as acute collective paranoia? We could say, of course, men are responsible. But then why in many ancient pre-Christian civilizations, such as the Sumerian, Egyptian, and Celtic, were women respected and the feminine principle not feared but revered? What is it that suddenly made men feel threatened by the female? The evolving ego in them. It knew it could gain full control of our planet only through the male form, and to do so, it had to render the female powerless. In time, the ego also took over most women, although it could never become as deeply entrenched in them as in men. We now have a situation in which the suppression of the feminine has become internalized, even in most women. The sacred feminine, because it is suppressed, is felt by many women as emotional pain. In fact, it has become part of their pain body. together with the accumulated pain suffered by women over millennia through childbirth, rape, slavery, torture, and violent death. But things are changing rapidly now. With many people becoming more conscious, the ego is losing its hold on the human mind. Because the ego is never as deeply rooted in woman, it is losing its hold on women more quickly than on men. Okay. This is the closing part of it. It doesn't really matter what proportion of your pain body belongs to your nation or race or gender. In either case, you can go beyond it by taking responsibility for your inner state now, even if blame seems more than justified. As long as you are blaming others, you are feeding the pain body with your thoughts and you remain trapped in your ego. There is only one perpetrator of evil on the planet: human unconsciousness. That realization is true forgiveness. With forgiveness, your victim identity dissolves and your true power emerges, the power of presence. Instead of blaming the darkness, you bring in the light. I hope that gave a lot of insight on the connection between pain body, panic attack, emotional flashback. I believe the ultimate remedy is presence, and that the steps leading up to that are the early levels of mindfulness, where you are learning to be aware, to catch the thoughts, catch the patterns that are operating internally, catch the voice of the inner critic. It's a lot easier to see in other people than it is to see in yourself. But if you do start to reflect on it and get introspective with it and apply yourself, you can see it. You can start recognizing it and have the relief of no longer being identified with it and lost into the story that takes you into panic mode. I really hope that helps. Good luck out there.